Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or whatever time it is in your area. I am really excited for this episode and discussion. This is, of course, the Parallax Viewer with your host, Andrew Flores, aka the Big Signorelli. And I'm really excited about this conversation because this text, I think, is very relevant. And the person who wrote this text or co-authored this text brings a lot of insight to the topic concerning Israel and Palestine and the genocide. But also, this is the first clinician I'm going to have on this channel, so that's also really exciting to get away from the sort of purely theoretical theory bro mindset. But uh, I have with us today Lara Sheehi. Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar and research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She's also founding faculty director of Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab. And of course, she is the co-author of the work Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, which we'll be discussing today, co-authored by her and Stephen Sheehi. And she has a recent text that just got published called From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. Laura, it's really great to have you.
So good to have you. It's coming out in May, so it was just released. And I'm also not at Doha Institute anymore, but I was for 2 years.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
But very excited to be here with you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is really great. And when I discovered the text, I was like, oh my God, like I feel like it's rare to find psychoanalytic works discussing really, what is going on right now in our time politically, with the crisis of capitalism that's constantly repeating, but imperialism and genocide that's just going on in Gaza. And regardless of the ceasefire, that's not enough. Like there's still terror. I mean, that's not a signifier that could encapsulate what's going on, but it's real politics. This is real things going on. And I feel like, not to discredit the movement of psychoanalysis as a whole, but I feel like personally speaking, when I see people talk about it, it's like, okay, or talk politics or decolonial, it's like so caught in a bubble that it doesn't apply itself to really what's going on right now. Because we force ourselves to adapt to a tragic situation. We can't apply theory onto it in a way that sort of obfuscates what's really going on. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if we're in a position where if we constantly have to revise or adjust or recalibrate the frame, so to speak, of psychoanalysis, we run into the wall of like a technical issue of how that frame was constructed to begin with and who it's meant to hold. I mean, every time there's a instantiation of real life, like you're saying, of material reality, of the reality of what most of the world lives in, whether that's we talk about poverty or state repression or living outside of the range of possibilities that privilege provides you, whether that's racial privilege or class privilege or anything like that. There's a way in which we're in a position where psychoanalysis goes, oh shit, now I have to like revise the way I think about this or hyphenate this or say this is an alternative way of thinking about it. For me, that's an invitation already into saying, who did this field and practice and method imagine to begin with? Who's the fantasied person, patient, subject that was constructed for this theory to take up in earnest? And certainly, I think we're seeing with Gaza for sure, like many other things, like many other fields, like many other theories, many other thinking, that it's certainly run into a wall. And it's run into, for me, its constitutive limitations. This is not just, oh, this overwhelmed the possibility for psychoanalysis to be able to handle or hold. It's run into a wall to unveil its constitutive problems and its constitutive Eurocentrism and its constitutive theft of being in its construction of an atomized European subject, right? That's the fantasied person that the theory most readily takes up and is well equipped to do so, but is really kind of imploding under its own contradictions when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, like you said, with material reality.
Yeah, and it's like, and then like with this going on, it just seems like there's also like with the problems and contradictions of psychoanalysis, the question of like, what is psychoanalysis, really good for everybody, or is it only a privileged, practice for the, petit bourgeois person who just has some like minor frustrations and fixations,
Yeah.
but is able to afford like $250 sessions twice a week. But we see literature growing and practitioners that uh, want to state the counter argument that no, like it is for everybody, whether it's the poor working class people in the barrio or in other forms,
Right.
like people that suffer from colonial violence, they have it unconscious. I mean, uh, going back to your text, like Fanon is referenced a bunch in there, and I know we'll get into that in a bit, but it just shows that like we have to. It seems like we have to be open-minded and not encapsulated, as you said, to the constitutive Eurocentricity of
Yeah.
the practice, right? Because we're
Yeah.
dealing subjectivity, right? That
Yeah.
is not reducible to the European mind, right, or the Western mind. Uh,
Yes.
and that even goes to the language that's spoken, because that's something that you bring up too, like indigenous language, or
Mhm. Mhm.
languages of the Arabic world, which is so different, in the
Mhm.
way that they interpret reality compared to the rationalized Western mind. I think you used this term in the text called abyssal thinking, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which, pretty much doesn't allow us to see what's going on outside of, European ways of thinking, if I
Right.
understand correctly.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is, you bring up a question of what type of psychoanalysis are we attuned to,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what do we consider to be psychoanalytic practice and what do we not consider to be psychoanalytic practice, which of course begs the question of the purity tests that oftentimes were put through around psychoanalysis, which naturally then says these are the people who practice psychoanalysis correctly, and these are the people who live outside of that. Now, of course, there's the famous, International Psychoanalytic Association that Deleuze, of course, brings up and goes, it's, Europe and the rest of the world. That's literally how they categorize things, which tells us everything we need to know. It's sort of like, here's the centerpiece, and everybody else is just like, a secondary thought and always in referential relationship with Europe. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, when I think about this, it is about not only disrupting that, but understanding, what modes of psychoanalytic practice are happening everywhere. I'm not talking about an institutionalized psychoanalysis. I think sometimes that trips people up. They're just like, but what do you mean? Like psychoanalysis is taught in institutes and it's not like it's happening everywhere. I agree with that. That type of psychoanalysis is not happening everywhere. But for me, if we think about psychoanalysis as a practice and method that fundamentally posits that the unconscious exists, that we have contradictory desires within us, that we are pulled in and seduced into identifications with various things that sometimes are patterned around relational dynamics that we have in our past, reproduced in the present, fantasied, taken up, played with, we spar with them internally, we try to make meaning of them, and that our being is constantly in emergence. For me, that's what psychoanalysis, all of that is psychoanalysis. Then we can see all the places in which psychoanalysis actually exists, or a psychoanalytic way of being or thinking exists, that many Eurocentric practitioners who are obsessed with the authenticity and purity test of an institutionalized psychoanalysis are constitutively misattuned away from. So this was, I think, part of our thinking when we were writing this book is a lot of people ask us, well, why psychoanalysis? And what I always say is in the most basic level, psychoanalysis because people practice psychoanalysis in Palestine. And the whole point is that people are surprised that people practice psychoanalysis in Palestine. So our question is really why? Why are we surprised that Palestinians practice psychoanalysis, or that there have been modes of psychoanalytic thinking and working through that predate a lot of the contemporary forms of psychoanalysis that we have, that it's not about, white psychoanalysts from the West going into Palestine and teaching them psychoanalytic thought. If to the contrary, if we go back, whether it's to political prisoners or go back to sort of early architects of thinking through and debating issues about the psyche, this is what we call the nafs in Arabic, which is psyche, soul, breath, self. Like we have this concept that encapsulates all of that. That for us is already a clue that thinking about the psyche and the self and the internal world has been a long-term project in the Arab world. And I think the misattunement is a fundamentally racist misattunement. It's not a neutral or innocent one. It's not just like, oh, I just didn't know that psychoanalysis existed in Palestine. It's like, it's interesting the patterned way in which you don't know, right? The patterned way in which the rest of the world doesn't engage in your fantasy, in your imperial fantasy, in your settler fantasy, that you just assume that the rest of the world is not taking up these questions. And of course, that's a civilizational discourse that is then supported and reproduced by the psychoanalysis that I think we see, the hegemonic psychoanalysis that I think we see. But these are the questions that are always interesting me. These are the questions that I push up against. These are the questions that I take the field to task about. And certainly the questions I think that are brought to fore by the remarkable stories of these comrades in Palestine that we document in the book.
No, that's wonderful. And I didn't even know that, like, how much psychoanalysis was practiced in Palestine until I read the text. But it is shocking that so many people do think, like, are confused by that, because I'm well aware that psychoanalysis is brought in the Middle East in general, like of all forms. So it goes to the point you made about the fantasy and the
Yes.
like that
Yes.
upheld and that, like, it has to have this sort of purity testing, or it has to come from this certain narrative of what history is and these practices and sciences. And so when a country that's non-European is practicing, it's like, oh, well, where did this come from?
Yes.
And I guess,
Yeah.
like, the way you distinguish between the institute itself, the hegemonic one, and then also just the practice itself, I guess this leads me to, like, the first point that I want to direct the conversation towards, which was, like, being both a practitioner in psychoanalysis, psychology, and a political activist.
Yeah.
I guess you've already said a lot, but what do you think as a whole, like, what is the state of psychoanalysis today as a whole, both the hegemonic and as a practice?
Yeah.
Because it does seem like, as we've listed, there are numerous contradictions, both
Yes.
in the institute and in the practice itself. And your work regarding Palestine, colonial violence, capitalist ideology seem to be an intervention, one that puts into question what psychoanalysis may fail to address, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that question so much. I mean, at the risk of sounding trite, it's in crisis. Psychoanalysis is in crisis. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I'm like, if you believe in your theory, perhaps you always know that there's going to be a crisis at hand, because dynamics are shifting and you're constantly working to make meaning out of what's emerging in relationship to the external world. So it's not, specific to psychoanalysis that there's a crisis happening or a reckoning of sorts. What is specific to psychoanalysis is the seeming unwillingness or lack of capacity for practitioners who think they espouse the theory to be able to use their theory to understand what's happening. And instead, what I see over and over and over again is people who believe in the unconscious until they don't. And it's as simple as that. It's like somehow the belief in the unconscious and all the theories that are actually weaponized against so many people, especially those of us who are minoritized and actually take up issues of liberation in earnest, in theory and praxis. Theory is weaponized against us very easily about how we're splitting, about how our aggressive impulses, about analyzing in the most intrusive and unethical ways when we're not even patients of people, except when it comes to this. And then people really struggle to understand why they are trying so hard to stabilize a field and why they choose over and over again authority over relevance. And I think that's the crisis that I'm talking about. Now, this is not a new crisis. We know what happened with psychoanalysis post 1970s in the United States, and it has its heyday, and then it becomes a pseudoscience. And with the push of, insurance companies and the regularization of CBT that goes hand in hand with capitalism and expediency and the creation of an individual and the over-reliance on cognition and science, we know that is also happening at the same time, rather than sort of a push to reclaim some of the more radical elements of psychoanalysis, including a very robust leftist history, a communist history within psychoanalysis. What we see is actually an ossification of the field slowly, and a more conservative element in the field. Again, nothing new. It was only in the 1990s that the American Psychoanalytic allowed, quote unquote, gay psychoanalysts to become psychoanalysts, to be part of that. So, and now we see, for example, psychoanalysts being engaged in consultation with these people who are pushing these anti-trans bills in the United States. So that's what I mean by it's not new. Psychoanalysts have always had a sordid history and relationships with the state in terms of building psychological warfare techniques, in terms of working with state oppression. At the beginning of our book, we talk about the making of the proto-state of the Zionist settler state and how psychoanalysts were a part of that. I think the texture of the crisis now is that there are many people in the field, myself included, other comrades like Avgi Sekatopoulou, like other folks like Carter, like Anne Pellegrini, folks really pushing and saying we're at a moment where we demand, those of us who practice and have an ethical responsibility to antagonize the field because we're representative of it. We've been brought up in it. We're trained in it. We have an ethics of praxis, that we demand that psychoanalysis cash out on its promises, its theoretical promises at least. We understand the field in and of itself, particularly in its institutional forms, is never going to be the space of liberation. But what we will not allow is the field to continue going on being as though it is innocent and outside these structures, and as though it doesn't lend credibility to violent systems or engage in really destructive and harmful processes, again, whether that's anti-trans issues or lending cover to genocide dares or weaponizing theory to suppress dissent. These are very real things that are happening in our field. And what we're sort of trying to say is you don't get to do that and also claim your innocence. Like for me, in many ways, I have a sense that psychoanalysis will be fine, because psychoanalysis in its hegemonic form is a form of power and it's a form of social reproduction, and it will stabilize and recalibrate itself. And there will be many, both fascistic and liberal forces that will come together to help it survive. This is the history of the world in terms of power systems that stabilize power. So I don't mind going hard at psychoanalysis. To the contrary, I think it's my responsibility, like I said, to continue antagonizing it. So I think that's the state of the field right now. It's both very exciting in terms of what type of theory is being done, what type of knowledge production is happening. When we push up against the seams, what's being produced, what are the ways in which voices that were historically entirely snuffed out or disappeared now have other avenues to kind of make themselves known. They're not reliant anymore. I mean, we have histories of, like I was saying, Marxist, particularly Marxist and communist psychoanalysts who are entirely, excommunicated from the field. They're just erased from history. Even Fanon is not taught in psychoanalytic institutes. He lives in post-colonial theory, in gender studies and race, those, critical race studies, all those sorts of things. But in psychoanalysis, not so much. So I think we live in a different time where we're not reliant on institutions or, the journals in these institutions to really talk about this and disrupt the hegemonic discourse anymore. So we're in a state of flux, and all I I kind of say like, bring it on. This is where we need to be.
Right, and with the state of flux and this push towards antagonizing psychoanalysis, I think is important because, as you pointed, there is a crisis to it, and it's nothing new. But I think it's like indicative of like all these contradictions we listed. But in so doing, it seems like it's doctrine and dogma over what is actually, in my opinion, beautiful about psychoanalytic experience. And I emphasize experience because, you know, someone like Fanon was deriving his theories of the colonial subject from his experiences working with them, right? And
Absolutely.
realizing that the sort of doctrinal analytic frame wasn't cutting it. Like, for instance, his criticism of was it Octave Benoni on the inferiority complex of the
Yeah.
colonial people, and he calls it the dependency complex.
Yep.
And it's like, no, like, you know, it seems like you're trying to find this dependency complex of the
Yeah.
subject outside of colonialism.
Yeah. That's
Um,
right.
and another example that I like, because you use this term always in the room with us
Yeah.
in your text, and this example of, I think it's a Palestinian clinician who was questioning, like, is this an example of splitting with this specific patient, splitting of the ego? But the reality is that he comes to realize, like, no, what is happening with this patient is just an experience of what it's like to live in an occupied place and being subject to colonial violence. This
Yeah.
anxiety is not sort of personal and interior to them. This is socio-political. This is a part
Yeah.
of their non-being. I wouldn't even say
Yes.
being, their non-being, because they
Yeah.
don't have the privilege to even have an ego, like a bourgeois subject that Freud and Lacan and, you know, Melanie Klein, not to discredit them, of course I'm a Lacanian, but just the fact that, like, you know, there
It's
is,
okay to discredit them. We're
yeah,
good.
it seems to be a privilege to have like a sort of ego that's full of malaise and depression, and be fixated in a neurotic way
Yeah.
in a Western capitalist society where it's like they don't even have the privilege of being,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and the only thing I would push up against that is like a sort of I definitely I'm not going in, and I don't think you are either, but I just want to make clear of this. It's not like an Afro pessimist perspective of like locked into a circular argument of non-liberation. To the contrary, the privilege that you're talking about is one in which the subject reaches to a individual atomized dismembered version of their ego, right? And absolutely not that there isn't the privilege of that, not just because there's a settler colonial condition that doesn't allow for that, but also because that is contrary to the fabric of indigenous society and of kinship networks that they're insistent on. And actually, that's precisely what an individualistic psychoanalysis that is misattuned from that reality and the necessity of a collective process and an interconnectivity among Palestinians, among we can sort of transpose this logic elsewhere too. This is specific to Palestine, but we can transpose this logic elsewhere, that it's not what people are reaching to. And so when we insist on an individual subject like Jessica Benjamin, who asks people to disconnect from their collectivity and become their biggest potential individual and lay down their guns in a liberation, struggle, and effectively succumb to the slow murder or swift murder that we're seeing right now in service of individuality. I mean, she's not shy about saying this is precise. This is what will make you a full individual when you disconnect from your collective. She like actually literally says that. That's that's the privilege that we're talking about. They don't have that privilege, not because they don't have the interiority or not able to do that, but because that is actually not the project, the socio-political project that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good point to clarify. Yeah, because like the ability to have the space time to, you know, disconnect from the collective. And I just think that overall that's just the, you know, relations of just capitalist, you know,
Yes,
society that just wants to
yes,
atomize us and
absolutely.
you know, not see the collectivity, you know,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
it's necessary to be able to survive. Even just, you know, as the human condition, we can't survive anatomic, like atomized, like, you know, it's
Yeah.
impossible. Like, you know,
Yeah.
we literally wither away. But even just like the amount of like psychological damage it does just not to have like a trusting community. And then imagine your community and your society is being dominated by settler colonial violence, and
Right.
your speech is repressed and censored, your form of being just compromised. I mean, that's just putting it lightly. But what I find really fascinating about this text too is the constant references that not only you and Stephen make, but also that you announce to the reader. It's like, we have engaged with these people. We went over here, and this is like a sort of not only theoretical intervention, but it almost seemed like it also changed your lives too. Like being able to uh, witness these first account, or just like the literature that's not talked about with these
Yes.
unknown psychoanalytic thinkers that are
Yes.
deriving this from their experience, not from framed theories.
Yeah. Yeah. It absolutely changed our life. And I think, you know, we don't say that lightly. And not just because we were in Palestine, which means something very specific for us as Lebanese, right? To be there, but also because there's something so important and ethically disruptive to the ways in which we are disciplined as academics and scholars, particularly in the imperial core, around what constitutes study. So we went there with questions, like good researchers, and we're just like, and then you get there and you're like, take stock of this and feel shame, as we should have, about like, what the fuck are we doing? What are these questions in the face of all of this? And what does it mean to remain ethical in our commitments to be non-extractive with the people who are generous enough to engage with us, who live under these conditions constantly? And it really pushed us. And we're people who are politically committed and have been for decades. And we still fell into this trap of like, this is what it means to write a good academic book. To get there and to allow the relational building, this is the parallel process, I think, that happened, to really allow the relational process to dictate what emerged and what became the book. And also to recognize that the book was not an endpoint. All of our relationships with these people continue. Um, we collaborate with them, both on an intellectual level, but on a comrade level and relational level. We've seen many of them over and over and over again. We meet with them continuously. We have ongoing relations. This is not just a research study, which was also really important for us to say, what does it mean to commit to a Fanonian praxis, to say that objectivity does not exist? Or to, if we bring in Martin Baro, to be like, he's just like, that's not the point. Like, objectivity doesn't mean that that you don't understand where bias comes from. Not being, there's just no such thing. If you know, imagine how ridiculous and unethical it would have been for us to come down with our political commitments, with our social location as Lebanese, who have been subjected to the violence of Zionism, whose country has been occupied, and pretend that somehow we didn't have a position on this. Of course, we had a position on it. And in fact, I think it's that position, and because we were so bold about it and weren't interested, just like Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks leads off in the first page being like, I'm not interested in this project of so-called objectivity. I'm a Black man. How could I be, right? I'm paraphrasing here, but that's kind of what he was saying. I think our positioning ourselves immediately like that actually opened up other possibilities with our comrades, because they were not tasked with having to hold all the consequences of what a neutral research position might have, for example, right? And I think that that is what we end up seeing in these stories and in the immense generosity of people bringing us in to their own conflicts around what does this mean. I think one of the things that runs through the book is you see people engaging in deep thought and reflection about the state of their work, about their own position around this, about what the boundaries between analyst and patient is, about sharing similar conditions, about what does it mean to have different conditions when you're somebody who has, for example, papers to live in Jerusalem, but you work in Ramallah, which is in the so-called West Bank. What does it mean to have settler-colonial citizenship in the state now known as Israel and work in Bethlehem? They're constantly taking up these issues. And I think us going there open to all of the things that were emerging in real time that we could never have anticipated is what allows this book to be what it is. The final thing that I'll say is, and I'll speak for myself, Stephen's not here to do that, is nothing prepares you quite for what it feels like to be in Palestine in this way. I'm somebody, again, I'm Lebanese. I was born and raised in Lebanon. I know what Zionist violence looks like. That was most of my life. I have studied Palestine. I've been part of the movement for Palestinian liberation since my early teens. This is nothing new. I knew what the apartheid wall was. Like, I can keep going. And yet, to be in Palestine and stand underneath that wall, for example, in Bethlehem, or go to checkpoint 300, like the one about that Samar, the first case that we start with, who talks about to experience that, nothing prepares you. Nothing. That in and of itself should change something in you, just like this genocide should have rewired something in all of us. And to allow oneself to have that happen to them, to kind of give yourself up to the process and say, if we're committed to a decolonial feminist methodology, then to give yourself up to the process and track and contour what emerges as in and of itself a scholarly endeavor, right? Is not just like, oh, this is scholarship and this is just like bullshit, secondary work. There's something deeply life-changing about that.
Yeah, and it just shows like, what you just ended with, the disconnect between what scholarly research and just everyday world experiences.
Yes.
And it's like, if being immersed in that situation that you cannot prepare for, especially as someone who is both politically active and interested in psychoanalysis, if you can't let that transform you and also transform how you think about the world, then it seems like you just end up adhering to not only a place of like complacency with the ideological framework and structure, but also with this fantasy of objectivity, where
Yes.
it's like a neutral subject that doesn't have to put yourself within what you're researching, because this is not this passive neutral research. As you said, it's like you're immersing yourself by not taking a stance of objectivity. As Fanon said, I'm a Black man. Like, I have no need for objectivity. The
Yes.
average citizen over there right now is not worried about objectivity. They're worried about their lives.
Right. Right.
And that goes for everywhere. That's like somebody that's barred from academia. They're not thinking about objectivity. They're thinking about things that coincide with their desire,
Yes.
whatever their unconscious formation is, just all these things that have nothing to do with the Eurocentrized scientific fantasy of pure objectivity and rationality.
Absolutely.
And
And yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that, like, I mean, just in fear of just running on, like, I think you explained that perfectly with the fact that everything that was put into this book was something that we had to throw ourselves in and
Yes.
prepare for that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not by chance that it's never the colonized who's worried about objectivity, because that's the life they live. It's always the colonizer that wields it and sort of uses it as a disciplinary bludgeon about objectivity to be able to have latches of innocence that they can sort of, escape from. So it's something for us to keep in mind about who it is that we always hear this objectivity, we need objectivity argument from. That's also pretty patterned.
Yeah. And I like the point that you made about like earlier in clarifying that, like, yeah, neither you and I are trying to think of this like semi or like Afro pessimism because we care about liberation
Yes.
collectively, and it's important that we see, regardless of what's going on, that the people think and that the people are active agents. They're not passive, because
Yeah.
then we fall into another form of, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree with this, but like another form of Eurocentrism where we see the colonized as purely victims and
Yes.
passive
Absolutely.
subjects that have no, and that's not the case. Looking at revolutionary history, we can look at like the revolutionary movement of slave abolition of Haiti. We see agents acting liberation. And I think
Yeah.
that's the main thing that you constantly pointed out in your project and in this work. It's like, it's about liberation, right? And
Yeah.
that there is latent within the struggle, a movement towards such
Right.
end of a liberatory praxis, right? Uh,
Yes.
I'm thinking of another person I'm influenced by, Michael Neil Cosmos. He wrote this work called Thinking Freedom in Africa, and he takes the same stance, from a thinker named Lazarus, that we need to stop thinking of people as just like passive, neutral agents,
Yeah.
especially those that are suffering from colonization, that people think, and because they think, that their thought aims at a political agency, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, this was Fanon's critique of Manoni, like you just
yeah.
brought up earlier, right? This paternalism.
Mhm.
And that was, and Aimé Césaire, of course, does the same thing.
Yeah.
He takes pot shots at, I mean, it's brilliant. I love his pot shots at Manoni. They're so great, right? Because they both track the racism that's involved in the paternalism. That paternalism is also not innocent. It's based on a fundamental racist idea about the lack of interiority of the colonized. The colonized in their eyes can only be victims, can only be dependent, like Fanon takes up and Césaire takes up, because they don't have the interior wiring like white people in the metropoles to be able to be, uh, to be able to exact the reality they want in their worlds. And so they need these saviors. Césaire goes as far as to be like, yes, do away with racism and colonialism, all that bullshit stuff. Of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but we have something better, psychoanalysis. Right? So I love that because it tells us the place that psychoanalysis then comes to take up. Manoni would be like, yes, colonialism bad, racism bad. All, there's most of the time, these psychoanalysts, particularly the contemporary kind, because I've certainly met some of them that don't do this, that are just outright colonizers and imperialists and racists. But the liberal kinds are ones who would say, of course we hate colonialism. Of course we hate racism. And then the stand-in becomes psychoanalysis. And that's what Césaire reminds us. He's just like, hold up. Manoni's like replacement of colonialism with psychoanalysis is another paternalistic way. In his case, he was talking about the Malagasy, of course, right? But he's just like, this is a way that you continue to reproduce the very same structures that, and forget, if we want to go to Fanon, that, and this is again me paraphrasing, that it's the colonized who creates the inferior. It's not the other way. There is no essential inferiority. The racist needs to perpetuate a system of racial hierarchy that will keep the colonized in their place as a basis of their racism and as a continuation of their futures, of settler futures, of colonizer futures versus the colonized. And you see that on full display in the context of Palestine.
Right. And with the hierarchy, it comes the internalization, to which like the colonized then have a relationship towards themselves that is
Yes.
from the internalized inferiority and dependency that doesn't come from them, but as you said, is bestowed upon them by the
Yes.
colonizer, right? And I'm thinking,
Exactly.
right now, like I'm doing a study on a Lebanese Marxist by the name of Madi Amo. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've heard of him.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
and I really like this point that he makes, that again, what we need to think of like colonialism as like a sort of necessity for the expansion of capitalist reproduction, and
Yeah.
it depends upon that, and that what that is a production of domination, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so domination takes on many forms, and we could see that in itself. And so, it's like for the, as you said, it's like, yeah, we fuck colonial and imperial psychoanalytic thinkers, but then you have the liberals that were like, no, we were so against that, but then they still adhere to the paternalistic logic of
Yes.
saying like we need psychoanalysis. But it's like, okay, all you just did was just change the content, but the form is still the same, and
Structure's still the same.
you're still adhering to that hierarchy,
Yes.
and you may put all your checks in the boxes of like, oh, indigenous this, black, LGBTQ, but you're still, I like this term that you use in the book of like trying to put them in a framework of restore and repair versus acknowledging the fact that what they're bringing goes beyond their sort of personal identity and the socio-political thing that just isn't happening in the room, and that the liberal bourgeois subject with their credentials does not see, or at least wants to disavow. They want to disavow it.
Absolutely. And restore and repair is a socio-relational political economy of stabilization of power, because it's the disruption, this is what I mean by going back to the theory. Psychoanalysis is a theory of disruption. It's an idea that things need to be disrupted over and over and over again for new things to emerge and get reconstructed, then taken back down and rewrite and reworked. And yet, when we see a force that is actually disrupting, we see the urge of liberals and all that alike to stabilize. And I think that's part of it, is the rush to repair means to stabilize things as is, and not deconstruct structurally what we know is actually causing or is the source of psychic suffering at the most simple level. I mean, this is one of the things that I take up in the new book. You were talking about the ways in which the colonized starts to think about themselves. And one of the major things I talk about in my new book that's coming out in May is how the psychic terrain in the psyche it needs to be stolen as well and intruded upon for the full force of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, all these systems of oppression to have their full force. Our psyche must also be stolen, and the rewiring of our interiority must be as well. A central piece of that is how to disrupt the way that the colonized thinks about themselves, to distort it, to not allow them access to thinking, to clarity, to disrupt the ways in which we remain tethered to material reality, with specific focus on who is doing the violence, to constantly have our eyes on that. I was just doing an event this past weekend, and there was a Palestinian, one of the organizers, Palestinian, from the 1948 borders, and she said something that I had come up against, that we both had talked about, and I think we mentioned in the book, how people within the 1948 borders of Palestine talk about confusion in a very different way than people who lived in the so-called West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem, or the Gaza Strip, because the fortification of the settler-colonial project is so intense within the 1948 borders of what is now known as Israel that confusion takes on a different role, meaning there's a constant forgetting that this is not a normative process, that these borders are not natural, that, settler soldiers walking around with their fucking weaponry constantly, but then at the same time sitting down in restaurants with Israelis who are your oppressors, that's also not normative. That's very hard to hold on to. And I think that's what I mean about like the theft of the psychic terrain is central to these systems. There's no way they can exact their full force and power without our psychic terrain being a primary piece of that, which is why, for me, I'm very invested in despecializing psychoanalysis and being able to talk about some of these ideas and what identification means, because I want to track the mechanics of it. How does this happen? It's not like the colonizer literally forgets they're not Palestinian, but what is the force of intrusions that would make it hard to hold on to that on a daily basis?
Yeah, and I mean, I think like from a psychoanalytic point, you bring up the emphasis of like all these different identifications, and I also like wonder if like even to the not even just repression in the psychoanalytic sense, but also like state repression in the ideological and even in the violent form of state repression plays into that as well.
Mhm.
Where it's just like you, either you live in bad faith and you do that, or it's like you are just so caught up in the libidinal identifications of that you can't even acknowledge that. You have to reject it or disavow it.
Yes.
Um, I want to steer back to the text a bit more with regards to, again, we brought it up a couple of times, this idea of setting the frame. And in the
Yeah.
beginning, that's what you do in the work of psychoanalysis under occupation. And it's with regards to this case study of a Palestinian woman.
Yeah.
As you both state in there, we intentionally begin this book with a case that complexly interlaces the dynamics of sexuality, gender, sociability, desire, and patriarchy within the dynamics of Zionist settler colonialism.
Mhm.
And so this case study exemplifies to me not only the patient's own symptomatic suffering, but also the overdetermination of political and socio elements that seem to manifest in the Palestinian subject. So would you mind if you recall, based off memory, like the intricacies of this specific case of this Palestinian woman?
Yes.
And also, how is this, as psychoanalysts or people that are interested in pursuing psychoanalysis as a practice, how are we to view the practice itself in light of this example of this case study?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So I'll try to be as concise as possible. It's such a beautiful, I find it to be such a beautiful case that we were
It
gifted
was, yeah.
from our dear friend and comrade Cesar Hakim,
Mhm.
who worked in Bethlehem and who has settler colonial citizenship. So, but he was, the head of the GTS, the guidance therapy center. It's like a family and guidance center, and they do such great work there. Anyway, this case is his, and it's about a woman in her I think 30s. Her name is Samar, this pseudonym that we gave her. And he walks us through how she came to his office to talk about death anxiety, and then walks us through the sort of intricacies of the case and all the things he felt very pulled and felt a responsibility to keep in mind. So, the most important things that we hear about her are her articulations of desire. And I think this is what we really focus on, about how she remains a desiring subject, right? To use Sarah Ahmad's words, and just like sort of being somebody who is not vacated of the desire just because she's a Palestinian Muslim woman, which is usually what we end up seeing, right? Back to your point about agency, about like somehow they're just vessels for patriarchy to control. And here we have a account of a woman who, despite the control, it's not like she's saying there isn't patriarchy involved. In fact, despite the fact that she loves her husband very much and finds him to be a very good man, she was in love with somebody else, and her family wanted her to marry this person. So she recounts being happy in her marriage, but lonely and doesn't have desire. This guy's her best friend, but doesn't have sexual desire for him. So we're already in the realm of, a desire that is very rarely thought about when it comes to Muslim women in general, right? Like we very rarely get in psychoanalysis a account of a patient unless it's pathological, or the liberal white feminist reading is that it's because she's being oppressed by, patriarchy. What Samar's case and what Samar herself articulates is one of the difficult things about making meaning, and this is what Cesar, the clinician, is so aware of, is what is what? What is patriarchy and what is the settler colonial condition? And it's that constant meaning making and his own awareness of that, both in terms of his gendered presence and not wanting to overextend himself as a therapist, as an analyst, because he realized, if I were to do that, if I were to impose an analytic framework or a reading of these symptoms on her, how would that make me any different than all the men in her life that dictate her movement and the way that she works? And he was racked with self-doubt, which perhaps is probably the most moving things, because he's not the all-knowing analyst. He's the analyst who is humble enough to say, I won't know unless I'm dedicated to this relational process of a knowing that is emergent and constantly in dynamic shift, right? Um, of course, we then learn that Samar, at the time she gets married, is the same time that Checkpoint 300 is constructed in Bethlehem. This is one of the most notorious checkpoints. It's right next to, it's also the construction of the apartheid wall that starts to happen, because when she was born, the apartheid wall didn't exist. And then by the time she gets married, the apartheid wall does exist, which means constriction of movement. And I think the case invites us into your question about what does this mean for us as psychoanalytic practitioners, of how do we imagine an ethical practice that might take up patriarchy and patriarchy's ability to constrict movement, but entirely leave out of the picture a settler-colonial project that literally builds walls that, in her case, where she comes from, the village she comes from, is encapsulated entirely by the wall. It's closed in by a wall. And so I think that the César's recounting of this case, Samar's own experience of it, and our ethical commitment to telling the story of material reality in addition to psychic process was one in which we purposefully wanted to task psychoanalysts with taking into account all the moving pieces, that if you wanted to focus on patriarchy and the constriction of movement from a gendered-based perspective, we're not saying don't do that. What we're saying is you better be responsible also for understanding what are the systems that work hand in hand with patriarchy. And settler colonialism can't do its work without patriarchy, without teaming up with patriarchy in a particular way, so that where she might have had spaces of movement, she no longer does, because she's entrapped by literal concrete walls and checkpoints and IDs that don't allow her to travel. So I think that was the invitation. And the final thing is to see her as a full human being, because what we also see are moments in which she creates life and meaning for herself through these, she cruises and she, catches the eye of young men and feels enlivened by that, but also is conflicted by that because she loves her husband. And so, like, this is a full human woman, not one that only exists in relationship to patriarchy, and also not only one that exists in relation to Zionist violence. She's working through this process with all the moving layers of collective responsibility and cultural baggage and personal desires and relational process with the analyst. And I think it's why we wanted it to be the case that opened up the book.
And it also seems like the emphasis of desire was really helpful in the analytic frame for César, because, like you said, like, if he were to operate at least like stereotypically as an analyst to impose something on there, then he would, in my opinion, just the description of her reality and the restriction of her movement based upon being trapped by walls, there would be a psychic wall that would develop in the analytic frame by doing that. And so I think that also shows, like, even just being in the position of being an analyst, the radicality of not knowing, right?
Yes.
And having to make an intervention by navigating through the person's desire, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what she has. She has this desire, and it goes beyond just the settler-colonial restrictions of her movement as a woman, and also being restricted symbolically as a woman that has to be married to a man, regardless if he's good or not, by her own family, and just pulling that tradition. Like, there's something else that's being worked through, right?
Yes.
But we should also see that in a way of, like, as you pointed, like the liberal feminism of saying, like, oh, it's just patriarchy, because at the same time, that's something completely different than the way one would view how patriarchy would work in a Western capitalist society.
Exactly,
We're
exactly.
dealing with a different overdeterminations.
Exactly. It's an invitation for us to be nimble enough to understand, what is what in a particular moment, and to provide space for a patient to make that meaning for themselves rather than a prescription or an overdetermination, like you're saying. And I think sometimes these Eurocentric models will over attune to one particular mode of analysis that's based in their own worldview and ideological positioning. And worse, they refuse to admit that that's where it comes from. Like,
Yeah.
where you reach to make your intervention, to make your uh, uh, you know, framework of analysis comes from a worldview that sees Samar only as a victim of her family's patriarchy, not the patriarchy and violence of Zionism, certainly, but also very specifically Arab patriarchy and
Yes, yes,
Palestinian
which is very
patriarchy.
specific too. Yes.
Very specific, because in that framework, very easily, I mean, we've seen this. This is why we have imperial wars to free brown women. Like, this is the same logic that would presuppose and insist that the global South, and particularly Arabs, own patriarchy. And that's why we need to save Samar. What the case in the sort of invitation is, what does it mean for us to commit to an agility of psychoanalytic practice, like you said, to not only not knowing, which is part of it, but also always grounding ourselves in the fullest picture that has to include material reality, not just the psychic part.
Yeah, and with that example too of like Arab culture and Arab patriarchy, it's so specific that it would, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would almost seem to, yeah, like fall back into the paternalistic logic and colonial logic of trying to be like, oh, all we just need to do is get rid of Islam. And it's like, no,
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
different history. And I'm thinking of I don't know if you're aware, this scholar, a comrade of mine, Daniel Tutt, had interviewed him
Mhm.
multiple times. Mohammed Soliman, who's I believe he's a historian, and he was able to free his family, and they now live somewhere in like Australia. But he had
Mhm.
lived most of his life in Palestine, and actually grew up somewhere like closer to the West Bank.
Mm.
Just talks about, that's like, this is a fact that many people in the West don't want to acknowledge, but we have to realize that Islam and is a part of our entire culture and identity. It's not something that you compare to like Christianity, and that way you can't just associate patriarchy with the religion. And it's just a complexity that I know I'm not Islamic at all, so
Yeah.
something that of my own ignorance that I'm unaware of that history, but it's just something specific to be like, we can't just be Eurocentric in the way it's like, if we just get rid of that, then that ends patriarchy. Like, no,
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
not at all. It's
That's the
so,
problem, right?
yeah, yeah. And I feel like in some way that's very like almost crude conservative way of thinking.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. No more liberalism there. Once Islam comes onto the scene, everybody becomes a conservative fascist
right.
imperialist.
Right. Yeah. And the universities want to censor, any sort of pro-Palestine movement as anti-Semitic, but then like what they're doing is in a form of Islamophobia that way as
Yes,
well.
exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah. And I know we've mentioned his name come up, we mentioned his name and he's come up multiple times in this conversation, but Frantz Fanon is
Yeah.
obviously a big name that comes up a lot in the work. And so to put it bluntly, like, what is Fanon's major role in psychoanalysis, and why do you deem him as a pivotal figure theoretically and politically, aside from this amazing lived experience research that you did with all these Palestinian analysis? Why Fanon? What do you see in him that we need to take up to task?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost is Frantz Fanon was a Black revolutionary that was
Mhm.
committed to a political project of
And I think that always gets left out when
gone.
people,
Totally.
yeah, read Fanon. It's like he was a
Totally.
Marxist.
Yeah, he was a Marxist. I mean, in Black Skin, White Masks, literally, I think it's in like page 4. He's like, I'm a Marxist first and I'm a psychoanalyst second. And that's what drives him. And I think the fact that he was also a Black revolutionary who was committed to the struggle until the day he died. And in fact, I think you were right earlier when you said he was learning about this through his own work. And I think there's an inextricability between his work as a psychoanalytic psychiatrist and his commitment to the struggle. It wasn't like he came to it afterwards. His connection with both these things was central to who he was because he recognized the sources of psychic suffering and that capitalism was at the heart of this, that plunder and colonialism that work hand in hand with capitalism, of course, and racial hierarchy were at the heart of a lot of psychic suffering. So for me, that is a centerpiece of it. And it's a centerpiece because Fanon also provided us such a beautiful, moving example of what it means for us to actually commit to a political praxis as psychoanalytic practitioners, that you didn't have to give up. For him, it was an absurd question to say you had to give up the revolutionary struggle, not the reformist struggle, the revolutionary struggle. We know that he housed revolutionary fighters and used the hospital as a way to hide them as refuge. So it also are questions of, if we have access to these structural or institutional things, can we provide cover? What is our role as mental health practitioners, not just to give treatment to people, but really a question of what is our actual concrete role in lending ourselves, our credibility, our institutional pull, and our resources to further the revolutionary struggle. In his position, it was to house people, to make sure that they were safe, to collect information for the FLN, to pass along information. He was a gun runner. Like, there's a lot of shit that he did. And I think that's the piece. And my dear friend and comrade Gail Lewis in the UK said something to me that I will never forget. She said, read Fanon as a comrade. And that changed the way that I've always been engaged in Fanon. I think he gives us a psychoanalytic grammar from the global South that, for me, I always say this, that for me, psychoanalysis begins with Fanon, not with Freud. And you can watch psychoanalysts have the biggest fucking meltdown when you say that. And I'm saying that not as an anachronistic sort of delusion, but to say, if we're committed to a disruption of Eurocentric psychoanalysis, what does it mean to insist that everything psychoanalysis, a Eurocentric psychoanalysis was built on, was also built on theft and plunder through the form of colonialism? And who better as a counterforce to say, let's start with Fanon. If we begin the project of psychoanalysis with Fanon, it reconfigures entirely how we think about psychoanalysis, the questions we're asking, what the purview of psychoanalysis is, who the subject of psychoanalysis is, and it moves us away from these traps of individualism and atomization and the bourgeois subject. That's not what he was interested in. He was interested in the liberation of Algeria primarily, but in liberation of the entire world, and the liberation and dismantling, liberation from and dismantling of capitalism and colonialism. What a better place to start for the project of psychoanalysis.
Well, that's very provocative, but I think that does hold a lot of weight because, like, obviously, Freud, we can't deny Freud, but I feel like, with Freud, he developed this science, you could say, just for the sake of the conversation. He discovered something that he had to derive from experience, and yet, like, when you look at sort of his social works like Totem and Taboo, Civilization is Discontent, like, we see something that's he's getting at, which is the problem not of civilization, but of bourgeois society. But it's like, even in group psychology, he kind of gets at something, but then stops. Like, he has this idea of the spontaneous group, which aligns with the revolutionary thinkers in the groups, but he never really takes that up to task. And then he has the dream of the revolutionary, where I forget how, like, the details of the dream, but it's like he's running late for something and he's having to catch this train, and then it has to do something about, like, worrying about his father, and then, like, the horrors and anxieties of coming close to this revolutionary group. It's like Freud himself as a scientist, having to take into account himself in the field of psychoanalysis, there is this sort of clinging to a paternalistic logic and
Yes.
the fear of the uncertainty driven by the affect of an agitation of the revolutionary movements that
Yes.
were occurring during his time. And so you could
Absolutely.
see like him oscillating back and forth. But with Fanon, and Fanon was very much engaged with Freud, even if he has like, some criticism of it. But I think Fanon takes it differently because he doesn't see, like, I think he even says something that's like, the colonized subject is different from the Freudian neurotic subject because they really can't have, he says, because of like the conditions they're in, they don't have this conception of time that is privileged to the neurotic, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was like really interesting. And so therefore, like also, even their formation of like their symptoms and the ego can't be seen in the classical Freudian lens because again, as we repeated, it's subjected to this colonialized method of being, or should we say, non-being and alienation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it manifests as a psychosis, not as a sort of narcissistic pathology, but as a reaction towards colonial violence and colonial
Yeah.
rule.
Right. Right. That is determined by the racial allocation of guilt. That's what
And
he
that,
says,
yes, yeah,
right? Is that
yeah.
like it's an intent to fix the colonized into a place of a presumed guilty position that is based on a racial hierarchy. And I think this is the important place. I love that you brought in that Freudian dream, which shows us like how far back this blueprint of displacing things into the father, right? Displacing things into the intrapsychic process. There it couldn't be that Freud could just contend with, oh shit, I'm anxious about these revolutionary projects, or which by the way, his theory had the capaciousness to do. Instead, he regresses and becomes concrete, forgets and remains in the symbolic order rather than the reality principle. And it becomes about the father.
Yeah, and there's also another moment too where he develops the theory of the superego, and he has this dialogue with a jurist by the name of Hans Kelsen, who accuses Freud of being a revolutionary because of his theory of the superego. So there's another moment in which he has
Yeah.
to reframe the theory of the superego in
Right.
fear of being accused of being a Bolshevik or a
Right.
communist. You know,
Right. And so he was, he was a liberal subject. He was not a communist. He was not radical in many ways, even though he did do some radical things like the free clinics and all those sorts of things. That was him. He wasn't as doctrinaire about praxis as people say he was. He took his patients on vacation, he fed them, he did all these sorts of things. He saw people for free. We know that. That's the revisionist history of that is interesting also about how it becomes a much more conservative practice with psychoanalysts coming to the United States, right? Usually for political haven, and then become very conservative here, whereas they might have come from socialist or sort of more communist backgrounds in the context of Europe. But I'm really fascinated by this, again, this sort of displacement into the symbolic order, where you're right, Fanon does something else. So in Black Skin and White Masks, in the chapter about the so-called dependency complex that we've been talking about, where he takes down Manoni in the most unbending, militant, unrelenting way, which I love. The entire chapter was just like, will not let heat off of Manoni because you shouldn't, right? There's this one passage where he's talking about this dream about a Senegalese soldier, right? And he's talking about the bull, and then he was just like, listen, again, paraphrasing here, he goes, the rifle is not a phallus here. The rifle is a real rifle, and it's this. And he like says the name of the rifle. So he's very clear on this. He's like, this reach, this escape to the symbolic order. It's very easy as analysts to go, oh, this person was dreaming of a phallus, and this is what it is, and the rifle is the phallus, just like Freud was saying, the revolutionary is my father. And Fanon goes, no, there's an actual fucking rifle, and that rifle actually murders people, right? And that's the brilliance of just like, oh, this is what you mean. Like, there are conditions like we see in Palestine, like we talk about in the book, of like the rush or the displacement into the symbolic order is actually a mode of violence that psychoanalysis does to displace material reality and fix the colonized in that racial allocation of guilt, right? Or racial hierarchy that Fanon talks about.
Yeah, and you dedicate an entire section or chapter, I should say, to disalienation as well. And I think this comes from, if I'm not mistaken, from Fanon as well, like working through
Yes,
alienation, the
yes,
process of
yes.
alienation. So how does the concept of disalienation play a role in your practice with people subjected, and not even just your practice, but our practice as psychoanalysts, as comrades, uh,
Yes.
with people subjected to genocidal violence and dehumanization in Gaza, as well as those in general, as well as those that are just general subjected to settler-colonial relations of production. Just to
Right.
put,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Just those small things.
yeah,
All of the
yeah,
small. Yeah. I mean, I think at the most fundamental level, disalienation in the way that Fanon describes it is a process. It's a political commitment, and it's a daily political commitment, right? It's not just like I'm disalienated and that's it. It's your commitment to the struggle that allows you to practice disalienation, which to me I would describe as a way in which we remain riveted to the material realities of psychic suffering and not just the psychological, or not displaced into the symbolic order like we were just talking about before. On the most concrete level, it's about remaining attuned to the forces of oppression that cause psychic suffering or that are intimately involved in it. He's not talking also about, erasing the individual entirely. To the contrary, he understands like what meaning making people make out of their symptoms are very specific to that person. I think he has this one section, I believe this is in Black Skin, White Mask as well. And he says something like, it's not our job to choose for people what their symptom means, but it is our job to always remain attentive to the structural pieces that are at play. And from there, people get to maneuver and understand what their individual investments in these things are. Like it's not about foreclosing possibilities for people. It's opening up possibilities. I think the foreclosure comes when we're in a space of alienation, where if we don't take into account the socio-political or the violent material realities that people live under, that dictate their lives, that saturate every part of their world, whether that's a apartheid wall or ice raids on communities or poverty, that saturates their daily existence, and they have to think about how to move through the world with that configuration. That is the practice of disalienation, to constantly have our pulse on the ways in which these structures become imbricated and tied up in the psychic meaning making process. And I think that's, to remain in that space is the real feat because there's so much seduction out of that. There's so much seduction by the systems of power themselves that would say that you're the problem, that you're the, violent person, the psychic inversions that are involved in that, certainly as we see in Palestine, and the seductions away that make us feel like we are individual failures, despite the fact that the structures in which we live our life make it almost impossible to thrive and flourish in the ways that we would imagine we want to. And I think that's also part of disalienation, is being able to name and track that and keep and remain aware that there are always structures at play and that our psyche is always being played upon. I think that's the piece for me, is that our psyche is contested space. And that means that systems of power will always try to intrude upon that. So for me, it's this is what I call psychic militancy. How do you engage in a political project, which is a form of disalienation? It's part of disalienation, that I don't think we can remain in disalienation without psychic militancy, of always being aware of the mechanics of these psychic intrusions and understand that our psyche is always up for intrusion.
yeah. And I think like thinking about Fanon's, theory of disalienation, and also like this point of like being in the zone of non-being, it's like also this struggle for human recognition, something that they're pretty much denied. And also, and to use the term that you use, racial is it racial allocation and
Guilt.
guilt. Yeah. I'm thinking of another figure who's also influenced by the specific point of Fanon, Domenico Lacerto. He has a book on class struggle where he talks specifically about this. And it's so funny how like there are many like Western Marxists that really want to criticize him because he focuses so much on an imperialism and colonialism as if like for some reason that's not right class struggle, was like, no, that is. And he makes this good point about Fanon and class struggle, because Fanon is in this tradition of national liberation and colonial struggle, which is another configuration of the class struggle in which this is a recognition struggle. Women's oppression and the sexual oppression, and colonial violence and the struggle for national liberation are a class struggle that's distinct from worker and capitalist, but it is a configuration of human recognition because they're always placed in this zone of non-being. And so there's this agency of a political demand. And I wonder if, like, psychoanalytically speaking, we have to position ourselves in a way where we're allowing the I wouldn't say struggle for recognition, but the desire for human agency to flourish. And especially thinking about the case with Cesar, the woman being able to like work through her desire and having that space for human agency, maybe not recognition per se, but being in a place where human agency can be worked through, where she could speak and bring meaning to her desire, where she's not walled in,
Yes.
by all these things.
And not constricted by the analyst.
Exactly.
Right? Which is the freeing force, right?
Yeah.
If we're going to step into, and I know there's a lot of problems around, the wording of agency, but I'm feeling what you're saying, and I don't want to be dorky about that. We know what we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's to freeing up of the condition of constriction that she lives under everywhere else. And in that space with Cesar, she experienced a relational process that wasn't primarily oriented around restriction.
Yeah, no, it's really, the more I think about it, it just like really deep, and it just makes me think like that this sort of thing needs to be, I wouldn't say implemented, but it's just like be more cognizant of, and the way that analysts like go about, and not sort of, again, to reiterate the point, act on doctrine and frame with and again, like you make this point, you and Stephen make this point about not using clinical language to inframe the people's speech. Like we have to listen to their language. I think it goes back to the dream of that Fanon was saying. It's like this rifle is literally
a rifle. Yes,
it's not the phallus. And so in some ways, sometimes like what the person is saying is not like a sort of neurotic displacement for the desire of the father or the mother.
Correct.
In some cases, maybe it can be, but that shouldn't be the overall framework, because I feel like at the end of the day, then we end up vilifying the criticism of, say, like someone like Foucault with biopolitics and the regime of the clinic, or Deleuze and Guattari when they are saying like, analysts are just like priests, or they're cops, like this.
They are.
Like that case of like the supposed psychotic who's paranoid that his analyst is a cop and is just like harassing so much that he ends up calling the cops on him. It's just like, you are a cop.
Exactly. It's the truth telling that comes from these patients that they can't handle. And
I think that brings to the another point that I wanted to bring up regarding this term that you use, psychoanalytic innocence. And it seems to me, from reading the chapter, it also seems to be a sort of ideological default that many analysts adhere to in the name of neutrality. So how is this problematic in your view, and what are some ways to, I guess, to combat against neutrality and analytic innocence as well?
I think psychoanalytic innocence, it comes from there's a history to this. It comes from a pedigree, whether it's like settler-Colonial moves to innocence, or Gloria Wecker talks about white innocence. So we use that same framework and then extend it to psychoanalysis. And this really does come from certainly my experience as a clinician, but Stephen being, in proximity to the field and sort of theoretically, taking and using and being very adept at taking up psychoanalysis as an academic. But really our experience with the ways in which psychoanalytic theory is weaponized when needed to further the civilizing mission or to further a settler-colonial logic or to further violence. And with the swiftness in which it happens, but also the insistence on innocence as it's doing it. So for example, let me give a concrete example because that's super abstract theoretically. What I just said is an insistence on dialogue, and this is the chapter. We really take up dialogue initiatives as being a centerpiece of psychoanalytic innocence. And this emerges from a couple of psychoanalytic projects in the context of occupied Palestine, where psychoanalysts took it upon themselves to go there and, in the fashion of saviorism that we're used to, think that importing psychoanalytic ideas for dialogue and using psychoanalytic framework to frame this dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, that would be the thing that resolves the issue, right? And what our concern really about this is, number one, the violence that's being prescribed onto Palestinians, as though engaging in that dialogue is a symmetrical process, and because it's not, and fundamentally it's one that demands that they lay down their claims to very central pieces of themselves, which includes their history, which includes their land, in service of dialogue and talking, which is a centerpiece of psychoanalytic process. And what we saw over and over and over again is when you push up against these psychoanalysts who peddle these theories, they get aggressive. They accuse you of not being rational. They are racist in their prescription about how we are not ready for liberation, and that's why we can't have these conversations. So even just laying out the problematics of this prescription of dialogue became a source of such consternation and perceived aggression on their part that showed us the mechanics of, like, actually, this is what this entire psychoanalytic innocence project is based on. No one moves that quickly to civilizational aggression if that is not what is at the heart of these dialogue projects, because the end point is really being able to reach this pinnacle of subjectivity and individual, process that is able to prioritize rational functioning reason and individual good over that of the political project of national liberation. And that's what is at the heart of it. Now, once we started to see psychoanalytic innocence, there's no way to unsee it. You see all the ways in which this happens, the disciplining process, and it's structural, it's not individualized, right? It's the mobilization of the discourse of psychoanalysis to really neutralize the political project of insistence and refusal, right? So that when somebody says, no, I will not engage with you, and I'm not engaging with you because the process of engagement, actually, I've already given up so much, even in being invited into this relational process. And if I name that, and if I name that that is based on psychoanalytic innocence, that you could imagine that I can engage in this without any violence involved, or that you can imagine, by the way, this is a great example of psychoanalytic innocence, of these dialogue initiatives imagining that because of their presence, this is when dialogue is happening, and at the same time ignoring every other instance in which a dialogue of violence happens at a checkpoint, for example. Those don't count. They think that bringing people into the same room is the only place in which an interaction with Palestinians and Israelis happen. And this is where we were like, no, the entire structure is based on interactions with Palestinians and their colonizers. Though you ask them to leave that all behind. When they leave the room, one of them goes back to being a soldier. The other one goes back to being a colonized person. You're happy with the dialogue that just happened and your imperiousness about bringing this civilizational process into play, but it's so violent in its honestly, it's so violent in its puerile liberalism, and it's also so violent in its insistence on forgetting and displacing material reality that dictates everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's like almost like leave your militancy at the door, but come in
Yes,
dialogue with us.
absolutely.
And I mean, it's just like another way in which it's the term we use earlier, the crisis of
Yeah,
psychoanalysis, that it seems that as it becomes a body and an institute, or just like a body of practice, that it too becomes subjected to the bourgeois intelligentsia of censorship.
yeah,
And what can be neatly talked about in a dialogue so far as that we're all in this room together, we could dialogue, and this is dialogue. But as soon as like we leave and real political shit happens, oh, we
yeah.
can talk about that,
No,
uh
no, that's
to,
political. That's you
to
not being,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
because
exactly.
it almost just seems sort of like whitewashed. And even like when they do bring in, or like when there are sort of the people that you know uh come from those situations that do experience that, they then become tokenized by
Yeah,
the liberal apparatus, uh, and also seen as, again, the pure passive victim mentality. But as soon
yeah,
as there is dialogue, real dialogue and discourse, that's where push comes to shove, and
yeah.
there is that analytic innocence
Yeah.
that comes in.
Yeah. When the
Right?
colonized comes into the fullness of their being, that's when they want to snuff that out, right? And again, the lie that a dialogue could happen when in one of these examples we use of the Viennese psychoanalyst who does these groups, dialogue groups, that Palestinians aren't even allowed to call themselves Palestinian. Like, how do you imagine that there's any when that is a condition of dialogue? And that's the psychoanalytic is that you still think you can claim that this is dialogue. You insist on that when all these conditions are placed upon the colonized. It's the colonized that is always asked for the concessions. It's not the colonizer. They're the ones who have to give up all their claims for their national liberation to even engage in these dialogue efforts. And that's what we were interested in sort of calling out and saying, again, not allow them to cash out on innocence. You are not allowed to engage in this way and not be called out for it and not have these mechanics of violence that you are not only shoring up but engaging in actively. It's not just complicity, you are actively engaging in this. We're just not interested in allowing that to continue to happen without acknowledging that, tracing it, putting it back in their faces. And if nothing else, fine, we see you for what you are and how this is used, and I think that that is a useful project as well.
Yeah, and I know on that chapter you mentioned like the ways in which psychoanalytic innocence operates, and you mentioned like um, I think it was like this section on like the indigenous people in Canada, how certain psychoanalysts have this sort of analytic innocence of not acknowledging
Yeah.
the settler colonialism that's going on in there.
In the
Um,
United States
in the
too.
United States as well.
Yeah.
And I guess like is this psychoanalytic innocence like purely something that happens in the Western world, or can it happen even you know in
Yeah.
colonized areas too,
Yeah.
where I guess going back to the point where there's this sort of compromise that even the colonized people take on a frame of identification. I'm
Yes.
talking
Yeah.
about like not just the people, I'm talking about like doctors, psychologists, analysts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think because it's structural, right? It's sort
Yes.
of like white supremacy. Like colonized and racialized people can enact white supremacy because
Mhm.
white supremacy is a structure that demands to be internalized in full and
Mhm.
replicated and reproduced in the ways that we relate with other people. That's what white supremacy is. Like you don't have to be phenotypically white to engage in white supremacy. It's the same thing. Yeah, there are ways in which psychoanalytic innocence is reproduced. I think the more adherence you have to this pure version of psychoanalysis, the more likely you are going to engage in psychoanalytic innocence because to be ideologically aligned, you have to engage in that. It's sort of like to be a Zionist, You have to engage in and believe in an eliminatory logic of indigenous Palestinians. That's what Zionism is. Like, you can't be Zionism light. You can't be like, I'm a Zionist, but like, no, I actually believe the Palestinians deserve their full land. Then you're not a Zionist if that's the case, right? It's the same thing. I think the bid to remain in adherence and coherence with an ideological position means you have to enact that and practice that ideological position over and over again. Psychoanalytic, in a sense, for us, is a centerpiece of that.
No, that makes total sense. Uh, Before we end the discussion, because this is amazing, I want to ask about the new project that's coming out regarding your new book that I referenced earlier. I guess my question is like just to plug to the listeners and the learners, like, and our just comrades in general, like, do you see this as a sort of continuation from this project we just discussed on psychoanalysis under occupation? Is this more like a more praxis based than just like a research endeavor?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about
Yes and yes, both.
Yeah.
But yes and yes, in as much as I think Palestine runs through everything I do, in as much as my commitment to the disruption of the conditions that would cause the suffering we're seeing, whether it's the genocide or the continuation of appropriation of land and land theft and home demolitions and kidnappings across historic Palestine, right? So Palestine figures in this new book. Where it differs is it is a book for comrades. It's a book for comrades. Not that this one wasn't, but this one was, I think, if I look at it, it's kind of a love letter to comrades on the ground, uplifting their voices and narrating what's happening. In this one, it is a sort of a distilled form of the modes where I take psychoanalysis and everything I've learned in the past 15 years of being in the field and saying, hey, folks, like, here's how psychoanalysts think about this. Here's the way we need to be centering the psyche in our struggles for our revolutionary futures, because the impact on our psyche is not secondary. These oppressive systems, like we said earlier, target our psyches and ensnare us in ways to demobilize us politically. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in saying it's sort of like following in Comrade Che's, work, where he despecializes medicine and like went into the field and was just like, I need to, all the things I've learned, I need to give to folks to be able to do this on an everyday basis. There's a similar process involved in this, but it really is for our movements to say, here's how psychological operations work. Here are the ways in which it's working all the time. And what does it mean for us to remain conscious of that as a daily political project to further our political aims for the revolutionary world that we want to bring into being? And that is, so my final chapter is about psychic militancy. That's more a praxis piece. I use both mundane examples of like examples that all of us will be aware of. I also talk about the different affect, whether it's despair, fear, confusion, all the things that we end up feeling as a symptomatic register for us to be aware that something is trying to intrude on our psyche. And more than that, something's tried to intrude on our psyche with the intent to make us disconnect from our political commitments and our revolutionary leftist political commitment. That's what I mean about it's a book for comrades, right? It's like, hey, this shit's happening all the time. Let's come together. I use real life examples to show this. I have some clinical examples with consent from my patients. I have some organizing examples. And then I have examples that we all know of our revolutionary heroes and political prisoners. Because the point is to be like, this has a long history. This is not us inventing it. Every political prisoner and revolutionary we know, if you look at their writings, knew the centrality of the psychic space to the project of violence. And then they wrote to us and told us, like Fanon, what the fuck we have to do to make sure that this shit didn't get to us. And most importantly, to make sure that we continued the fight that they started for us.
And I like that, a book for comrades, and especially given the fact that you said if we start psychoanalysis origins from Fanon, we also are reading him like a comrade, and so
Yes,
you have to learn and practice psychoanalysis comradely as well, right? And
exactly.
I
I
think I
love that.
see,
Yeah.
yeah, now like because there's always been a strong history, which again is not talked about as much, and when it is, it's only like Wilhelm Reich, Deleuze and Guattari,
Yes.
with psychoanalysis and Marxism, or just militancy in general. But you see a whole wave of it in Latin America, and
Yes.
it seems like it's our job to take it up to task, given the fact that Fanon himself says, I am a Marxist first,
Yeah.
but in his investigation and his militancy, he's also practicing and learning about the colonial subject from a psychoanalytic point of view, and how we could apply that today from our own experiences in the collectives, in organizing, in the barrios, in in the battle,
Yep.
pretty much. I think, yeah, it's important. I think the main thing is like the desire, right? I think the desire,
Yes.
especially politically, knowing that we have political demands, at stake, but then also cultivating them into desire for a revolutionary project as
That's right.
psychoanalysts, psychoanalytic practitioners, but then also as militants.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. This book is for
Yeah,
militants.
yeah, it is a militant. Thank you
Yes.
so much, Laura, for coming on, and
Thank you.
this was a wonderful conversation. Definitely have to bring you back on to talk about the work when it comes out.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'd love to.
Yes. And thank you all for joining in. And I hope you learned something today. And again, this is not a podcast. This is, again, a learning platform. It's all free. This is communist as it could get for psychoanalytic thinkers and for political thinkers as well. So thank you all again, and tune in next time.